My name is Bert, and this is the Still Life Podcast. Welcome back to the Still Life Podcast. I hope everybody had a great weekend. This is episode 11 and part 4 of my Deployment Memories series. And I really didn't want to get too crazy specific about details pertaining to events that I encountered or experienced, but I wanted to kind of talk in general about some of the things that happened and how they have affected me now as an adult. So, like I said early on in the series, I was all of 20 years old. In fact, I had my 21st birthday on deployment. So, still really a kid for all intents and purposes. I mean, I had my whole life ahead of me. So, I really had nothing to do but learn. You know, as a kid coming straight out of basic and AIT, roughly 4 months later, here I am getting deployed, fresh out of communications school, thinking I know everything there is to know about communications and how to do my job in a real world or battlefield environment. And so there's something about being a young 20-something and really not knowing what you don't know. And quite frankly, it wasn't even until I got into my 30s that I really started to realize just how much I didn't know. I lived in this state of ignorant bliss in a lot of ways. It wasn't that I chose to not learn or understand these things. I was just kind of oblivious to a lot of stuff. And it really wasn't until I changed my mindset on learning that I began really to understand just how much I don't know in so many different areas. And now I'm on this quest to know and learn and understand as much as possible about myself and about the world around me. I mean, I remember an instance where I got into a shouting match with a senior NCO because they were trying to tell me how to do my job. Now, they weren't signal, but they'd been in about 15 years longer than I had at the time. So, they probably, and not even probably, they knew better than I did because they had an understanding of how all the pieces work together. And again, being confident, overly confident about what I knew versus what I didn't know, it got me into trouble a few times. But in this specific instance, I couldn't even tell you what the argument was about, but I do remember that it almost came to blows. We, had fist cocked and were ready to throw. So, that was really in large part because of my ego as this kid. You know what? I know everything. I'm fresh out of school. There's nothing that I can be taught that I don't already know. And I could not have been more wrong in so many ways. And I mean, even in previous episodes, you've heard me talk about how I had this attitude of learning and experiencing the world and all of these things. And while I had that in many aspects, when it came to my job, I didn't have that. I wasn't open to learning, especially from people that didn't do my job. Because again, I thought I already knew everything there was to know about my job. So that was a humbling experience when I realized, okay, not only do I not know everything, I don't even really know a little bit about my job or about how to work in tandem with other pieces of the puzzle and other parts of the unit to make sure that things are as efficient and effective as possible. And really, it wasn't almost until about a decade later that it finally occurred to me and I realized when it comes to doing a job, really I need to check my ego at the door. And I need, in order for me not just to be a good manager or leader, but really to be a good employee and a good team player, I need to be open to listening to the input that others provide me. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. There's people, obviously, that you don't want to listen to, or you really don't want or need their advice. But for the most part, we all look at things very differently. And while I see things a certain way, somebody else may have a solution or a workaround that, I don't see, and they bring that up to me, and it's like, it's a game changer. Wow, I never realized I could do it that way. That's so much easier than the way I was approaching this task or issue. Now, I will say one of the other big lessons that I learned that I may never have learned otherwise was take more chances. And that sounds crazy, spending time in a combat zone and coming home and saying, you know what, I need to be more risky with my life. Well, that's exactly what I did. And the reason I changed in regard to taking risks or chances, not really in regard to my safety, but as far as learning or opportunities for growth, what it came down to, after the war first started, it was probably about a 2-week period, the Iraqis were firing Scud missiles at us about every 90 minutes. Now, 2 weeks into this, it wasn't a big deal. The alarms and sirens would go off. We'd throw our gear on and go huddle up in one of the bunkers. But those first several days, it was terrifying. I mean, you're talking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every 90 minutes, sirens are going off. There's, Scuds being fired at us. We're firing Patriot missiles back at them, trying to take them down, knock them out of the sky, and we're having to run into these bunkers. And it was really about the third night of these attacks that, I'm sitting huddled up in this bunker with my Kevlar, my flak vest, my chemical suit, and my rifle, and I'm just like, I know like 2 other people in this bunker. Is this really how I want to die? And in short, the answer was absolutely not. I wanted to go out on my own terms, doing things that I loved doing. Now, obviously, that's a little bit hard to do when you're on deployment, you're in a combat zone. But when I got back, I was less afraid of failure and more apt to take risks, in relation to career choices or really general life choices. Because at the end of the day, what was the worst that could happen? It wasn't any worse than me sitting in a concrete bunker, hoping and praying that we didn't get hit by a missile and blown up. There's not a lot here at home that can make me feel that same way. So at the end of the day, it changed my outlook positively and had a wonderful impact on my life. So really, in conclusion, the things that happened, like I said, while there were some wonderful things and there were some terrible things that, I witnessed or was a part of or experienced in my time overseas on deployment, all in all, it was a positive experience because I chose to use those things to learn and grow from. I know people that had very similar experiences that said their deployment was awful, it was the worst thing that they've ever done, they've hated it. But, I believe a large part of that comes down to, number one, the way that we take in all this information and all these different, sensory events, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and then how we translate those, work through them, and we either use them to grow or we let them really cripple us and disable our ability to function in certain aspects. Now, I want to say that, there are definitely things that did have a negative impact on me that I still deal with almost 20 years after the fact. So, not to say, well, everything was positive and great and rosy and I came back and life was just wonderful. No, I have lingering effects and will for the rest of my life of those experiences and from those experiences. Now, again, overall, my experience was very positive. That doesn't mean I don't have scars physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever, from that experience. I most certainly do, with the exception of maybe physically. I wasn't shot at, I wasn't blown up, nothing like that happened to me, so I can't speak on that. But definitely, psychologically, emotionally, mentally, there are scars there. That's something I work on, work through, deal with on a day-to-day basis. But, again, overwhelmingly positive experience. I learned, I grew tremendously, and because of those things, I've changed my outlook on life. I've changed the approach that I take to learning and to accomplishing things. And all in all, it has helped refine who I am, and I believe make me a better person in so many ways. So, guys, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for joining me on the Still Life podcast. This concludes the series on my deployment memories. And as always, if you have questions, comments, topic ideas, or suggestions, or would like to sponsor the Still Life podcast, you can email us, thestilllifepodcast@gmail.com. That's thestilllifepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining me today on the Still Life podcast. We'll talk again soon.